Are you being controlled by pornography? Are you sneaking away into dark, secret places, living with your shame and your guilt every day? Then today's video is for you. I'm going to answer the question about what's really going on when pornography gets a grip on your life and takes control of your decision. G'day guys, if we haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Andrew, and just like many of you, I have been exposed to the negative impact of pornography like so many young men in our world. Fortunately, I've escaped that, and I've had the privilege of helping so many young men in the role of counsellor and psychologist over nearly 3 decades to get free from that control and get back on track with developing healthy masculinity and living the life they should have always been living. Let's go to that conversation now. We've been talking about factors distorting the healthy development of masculinity in our young men. And we've got another episode on this subject today. I'm talking today about the impact of pornography. Pornography has had and is having a huge impact on our young men, our teens, our young adults, and men everywhere. But what it's actually doing is it's playing a huge role in distorting the healthy development of masculinity in those that are affected by it. You know, if you've been watching the channel and you've been watching recent episodes in this particular mini-series, we talked about the influence of fatherlessness. We also spent time on a recent episode talking about the impact of social media. I'm not sure that anything is having more of an impact on the unhealthy development of masculinity right now than the factor of pornography. It's distorting the development of masculinity in our young men wildly and at an exponentially increasing rate, and we've got to talk about it. And of course, as always on this channel, we've got to lay down again the reinforcement of the correct definition of the word masculinity. And we're talking here about original masculinity, not this new age stuff where people have tried to hijack the word and rebrand it as toxic masculinity. Those things should be separated. They don't belong together. What we're talking about is healthy or unhealthy, but masculinity in its original definition, no problem, because here's what it means. It means to protect, provide, and empower. And I can't find a single sane person on the planet that's got a problem with people getting protection, provision, and empowerment to be their best. Anyone who says they have an issue with that is not actually being serious, or they could actually be a little bit loose upstairs, if you know what I mean. Original masculinity is all about protection, provision, and the empowerment of others. And in today's episode, when we're talking about the impact of pornography, nothing could be further from the truth that masculinity is any other definition. We've got to have this ringing in our ears. In fact, recently on these episodes, I talked about some very alarming statistics that are going on with our young men. Let's take a look at those statistics now. 19 males go to prison for every one female. 98% of all sexual assaults are committed by males. 90% of robberies are committed by males. 92% of abductions are committed by males. 87% of homicides are committed by males. And in Australia today, an average of 9 people per day will die by suicide. 7 of those will be men. Here's a very alarming statistic, as if the others weren't. 1 woman is killed nearly every week in Australia as a result of family violence. As you can see, pornography is a massive problem for our boys. Very sad to even say that it's affecting our young boys, but especially our teens and our young adult men. And we've got to ask the question, why is it affecting them so much? Why is it such a negative impact on the development of healthy masculinity? Well, I want to give you a few reasons, and I want to outline for you today what it's actually doing. And you need to hang around right to the end of the video, because I'm going to share a few thoughts that are probably not ever mentioned in regards to pornography, thoughts you may never have heard before. But let's talk about why this is such a massive problem. Well, number one, young boys, young children, but especially young boys as we're talking about it today, they are not mature enough to cope with the imagery that's flooding their senses. They barely know what's going on in the world. They have no clue who they are. They are prepubescent when they're young primary boys, when most of them are being exposed to this stuff. And they are nowhere near mature enough, even in their teen years, to be able to cope with the kind of imagery that they're being exposed to, that in a generation not so long ago, virtually nobody was exposed to this kind of imagery. They're just not mature enough. Number two, pornography to our young men, our young boys today is so easily accessible. In a bygone era, you had to fight and work hard to figure out how to get it. In today's world, you've got to fight hard to figure out how to stay away from it because it's everywhere. You know, I can remember my own personal story of my first exposure to pornography. I remember being in year 11 or grade 11 in high school. So I was 16. Think about that even as a comparable, that my first exposure to this was as a teenager, not a 10-year-old, 11-year-old. I was almost 17. And I remember going to a friend's house with a group of our friends, and one of the boys that was there had brought along a couple of Playboy magazines. Even that sounds funny to talk about when you think about how far down this sewerage pipeline we've actually gone, that we talk about magazines. But he had gotten them from somewhere. And I remember him then getting those magazines out and showing all of the guys in our group, and all of us being a mixture of collectively shocked or collectively magnetized to what we were being shown. But basically the main thing that came out of that experience is not so much the naked imagery that we'd been looking at, but all of us going away from that moment being shocked about the fact that somehow he was able to access this material. And it was almost as if that reality, his access to the material, was almost even more shocking than the material itself. And it's testament to how far down this slope we've traveled, with how lazy we've become as far as accessibility. The third reason why this is having a huge impact on our young men is it's putting a heavyweight burden of sexual temptation and sexualization into their thinking, and that they're in their identity that they're just not wired to cope with. And so we are seeing a tremendously negative impact on their development. It's setting them on a trajectory that they cannot cope with or understand, and we've got to understand in great detail what it's doing as it distorts their development. So let's talk about that for a moment or two. What is this exposure to easily accessible pornography doing in our young men? Well, number one, and all five of these points are crucial, and they're all pretty heavy, so stay with me if you can, but it's important that we talk about it. Especially those of you who are watching who might have children. You're a dad and you need to know what's going on in the development of your children. But here is the first thing that's happening. Number one, pornography teaches boys to objectify women. Nobody can raise a decent sound argument against this truth. Pornography teaches our young boys and young men to objectify women. Now, it's a massive problem. Let me explain why. It's a problem because by nature, an object is disposable. An object is temporary and without worth. Now, you put one and one together yourself as you're listening and watching. What is going to happen if the wiring in the brains of our young men are correlating female with disposable, temporary, and without value or worth? The obvious domino effect is very, very frightening to contemplate, and we're living in it right now. Pornography teaches young men to objectify women, and objects are disposable, temporary, and got no value. And what happens to these young boys is they develop an inability to place value on a relationship with a female, because pornography has trained them, rewired them progressively, and there are far more skilled neuroscientists than me who can explain the development of neural pathways as it pertains to the relationship with pornography. But even at an observational level, we can see that young men who get stuck in this trap, they grow an inability to place value on relationship with a female, and she becomes just another commodity like other commodities. They learn that the female only exists for what she can give to a male. Now, why does that happen? Because that's the exact purpose of an object. It doesn't matter whether you talk about an expensive object like a car, which exists to help you get where you're going. That's its only purpose. Or whether we talk about something inexpensive like a box of matches. It only exists to help you start a fire. But both objects, as is true of all objects, their only function is to give the user what the user needs in that moment. This is why the objectification of women through pornography is such a huge danger to our young men and to society, because it teaches those men that the female only exists for what she can give to a male, especially sexually. The inferences here are obvious, and if you can't pick them up, you might need to go through a process of unraveling your desensitization to what's going on in the world around us. What happens is men and women, when pornography is at the center, they begin to exist on what I would call a one-way street. In other words, all of the giving flows one direction, and it's from the woman to the man, because the man has trained himself that she is an object that can be possessed for his benefit when and how he chooses. It's a one-way street, and effectively what you end up with is another version of slavery. There's a process and a sequence that goes on where this woman gets redefined in the mind of that young man as being an object. And when she's an object, the focus is what he can get from her. When the focus is what you can get, there is no value attributed to her. And then she becomes naturally mistreated from that point onwards whenever she doesn't serve the needs that he is wanting in that exact moment. From object to a one-way street of giving, to having no value, to mistreatment, and the ultimate horrendous scenario is when we see relationships where the woman ends up being the victim of abuse and violence. And without question, without argument, without a shadow of a doubt, the presence of pornography in the life and the minds of young men is a huge contributor to those relationships ending up becoming abusive and violent for the women who have to live this way. And really, when it comes down to it, this is the Andrew Tate story. His early days riches came from taking advantage of young women to undress in front of webcams, to expose them to pornography, to leverage off the temptation and desire in young men who wanted to see that imagery, to make money from them. And Andrew Tate shows us the life that exists when you objectify women by reducing them to simply a tradable sexual commodity. And now the objectification has taken him to where he's gone. That, my friends, is not healthy development of masculinity at all. In fact, it's the polar opposite. And so pornography, without a shadow of a doubt, objectifies women, whereas healthy, original masculinity, it teaches a young man that his purpose in life, in relationship to women, young and old, is to protect, provide, and empower. And that's why I'm always banging that drum on this channel, that that's the purpose and the role of a man in life. If we keep telling our young men that their purpose is not to protect, provide, and empower, they will find another purpose. And if it ends up in places like the objectification of women, we all lose. Pornography teaches a young man to turn a woman into an object. Number two, what does pornography do in the development of young men? Number two, it normalizes the separation of sexual intimacy from committed relationship. I'm going to read that again because you need to hear it again. Pornography normalizes the separation of sexual intimacy from committed relationship. You see, sexual intimacy simply becomes a tradable commodity. One of the greatest examples we're seeing play out in our world today in a far more prominent fashion is where young men and young women are already doing a dance, playing a game of trading commodities with one another to get the things that they hope to get from the other. Whereas original masculinity is driving an old school value of relationship that is two-way street, that serves one another, that puts the focus on what it can give to the other, What we are seeing prevalent in today's world is young men and young women trading commodities of what they can get from each other. And the most common one we see is this. We see young men using the commodity of attention and pseudo-affirmation to lure girls into relinquishing sexuality and sexual encounter of a physical nature only to those young men. Watch it again. The young men are learning that they can lure and bring women close to them if they find them attractive sexually, bring them close, show them enough pseudo-romance, pseudo-care, pseudo-affirmation so that the girl feels affirmed and valued, which is what she's trying to get most of the time. And what he's trying to get is the sexual encounter from her. So she gives him the sexual encounter, he gives her the pretend romance and affirmation, and instantly what you've got is not a relationship, you've got a transaction. And the saddest thing that we're seeing in that environment in today's world is how many millions of our young men and young women know that that's what they're doing, and they're happy to play the game and do the dance. The separation of sexual intimacy from committed relationship is being normalized at astronomical levels, and the damage is profound. What happens when this kicks into gear is it further embellishes the objectification of women that we already talked about in point 1. When people repetitively separate relational intimacy from sexual intimacy, the less able they become to achieve relational intimacy later in life when they eventually desire commitment. In other words, we see mostly young people, but also some immature middle-aged people doing this dance, playing this game, trading these commodities until they reach a stage in their life where they go, okay, enough fooling around, now I want to have a committed partner for the rest of my life. What they then discover is they have an incredible inability to actually do the thing that the heart truly longs for, to be committed and intimate, because they've been trading themselves away for years and years and years. Which brings us to point number 3. What is pornography doing to our young men? Point number 3, it's developing in them an inability to bond with a life partner. Now let me take you somewhere where you probably haven't been, or maybe not heard very often. As humans, we are body, soul, and spirit. We are 3-part beings. The body part is obvious. The soul is made up by our mind or our thoughts, our emotions, and our willpower. But there's a third part of us. There's an eternal part of us, our spirit. It's where our belief and our values and our worldview and all of these things live, the eternal, invisible part of us. And here's the deal. What's hardwired into creation is that sexual intimacy was designed to exist in a marriage between men and women so that the sexual intimacy could be enjoyed and it could become the bond that glues that relationship together for all time. This is why those of us who are married or have been married, we remember standing at the front of a church building or in a garden somewhere and making promises and vows along the lines of, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do we part. Now, it sounds great when you're 25, but if you live to 85 and you're making a promise about staying committed to this one person for 60 years, let's be honest, that's a tough assignment, even when you love each other. That's part of the power of the sexual connection, is it bonds the two people together, body, soul, and spirit. But here's the problem. When we have young men and young women, even middle-aged women, even older men and women, it's so prevalent today, but people who are using sexual intimacy as a tradable commodity, especially because women have been objectified through the avenue of how pornography rewires the brain. When that's happening, we see people partnering sexually with 3, 4, 10, 12, 50. Recently in the news, we saw this horrific, disgusting, vile promotion of the woman who was bragging to the whole world that she was planning to film a video of her having sex with 1,000 men in a 24-hour period. What that woman doesn't understand, and whether it's 1,000 or 100 or 10, what those people don't understand is that every time they have that sexual encounter, they're breaking off bits of themselves and giving them away to people. Now you think about for a moment, when people have had 10, 20, 30 plus sexual partners, what is actually going on there behind the scenes in the invisible part of who we are? They are bonding themselves, small portions of themselves, to small portions of other people. Any wonder they can't bond properly later in life when they grow up and want to be committed in a relationship, because they've given themselves away to so many others that they're still connected to and they're still bonded to. And many men struggle. I have counseled them. I have coached them in my role as a counselor and a psychologist. Many men struggle in their marriage because they realize they still feel a sexual connection to the 23 other women they slept with before their wedding day. This stuff is real, people. You can't ignore it. It's actually true and provable by what we see going on in people's lives. And so the inability to bond is a huge thing going on, driven by pornography. Point number 4, what is pornography doing to the distorted development of healthy masculinity? We have a problem because pornography is habit forming. Now, we don't have time to talk about all of this today, and there are people who are more skilled than I am, like a Dr. Andrew Huberman and others, but you can do your research online to find vast quantities of empirical data displaying and demonstrating that what goes on when men get addicted to porn, even women, but we're talking about men today, when they get addicted to pornography, what's going on in their brain is that there is a frequent and misused, disproportionate release of dopamine in the brain, whereby habit-forming behavior begins to kick into gear and spiral. And so we know how this works. The person sees the image, they get lured in, they get tempted. Usually they go through some kind of self-gratification, pleasuring themselves, and then there is a huge dopamine release that is bonded to the experience of the imagery. But over time, what happens is those same men need more and more hardcore imagery, more wild fantasies to drive the same amount of dopamine release in the brain. And they are literally rewiring their brain through the relationship of dopamine and the power of addiction. If we were talking in brain anatomy terms, we would call it neuroplasticity, which is the factor and the dynamic that, depending on the stimulus you feed to the brain, you have the power to reshape the literal physical brain anatomy of your brain and rewrite or rewire the neural pathways so that every single time your brain gets exposed to familiar stimulus, the electrical synapses in your brain fire into gear and send you down the same neural pathway of choices and behavior that you've been down so many times before. We call it addiction. And when people get addicted to pornography, they get a dopamine addiction and they get this virtuous, non-stop, perpetual loop that keeps sending them round and round and round and round, and they seem unable to break free because the power of that thing in their brain and in their emotions and in their life has got a hold of them, and now they're trapped in this never-ending cycle of a habit-forming addiction solidified by the release of dopamine in the pleasure center of the brain, which is the reward center that tells them chemically, this behavior, this choice is good for you because look at the reward hit we just got. You need to do some more research on that. It's powerful and scary at the same time. Number 5 reason, our last in today's episode, what is going on in our young men, in all men, when they're exposed to pornography, and what is it doing to their development of masculinity? This one is more anecdotal, but it's very, very important. Men in this situation are suffering from shame, guilt, distrust, isolation, and secrecy, and their mental health plummets and takes a dive that is difficult to recover from. Why is this the case? It's the case because our soul has not been designed to cope with those heavyweight baggage items to carry around with us every day. The nature of pornography is that it pushes people into a place of secrecy and isolation and distrust, and it distances them from the relationships with the people in their life who they actually love and care about. Shame, guilt, distrust, isolation, and secrecy become the residue afterfruits of exposure to pornography in this way. And ultimately, what happens, especially in our young men who are not mature enough, their brain is not developed enough, they are not neurochemically developed enough, some of them haven't even gone through puberty yet. What happens for those young men is that they end up in a nosedive of poor mental health because of what they've been engaging in. It's pretty clear to see that the impact and the effect of pornography on young men, older men, all men in developing and retaining healthy masculinity is significant, and we've got to talk about it. We've got to have these conversations, and we've got to help rescue our sons and our brothers and our fathers from the traps, the shackles, because you don't want to become the marionette of the puppeteer called pornography, controlling your thoughts, controlling your decisions, and putting you at odds with the very purpose you were designed for, especially as it pertains to how you relate with the women in your life. I'm glad you took the time to watch this episode. Make sure you share it with a friend who might be struggling in this regard. Leave a comment down below. Share your story, share your experience. Let's keep the conversation going so we can help release more of the brothers from this horrible, horrible trap called pornography. I'll see you in another video real soon.